Well, welcome to this afternoon's cooking demonstration. Oh, wrong one, wrong crowd. Talk about misreading the crowd. Good afternoon and welcome. Today I'm talking about Australia's Aboriginal and Islander history. Bit confronting in some ways, but I've got some wonderful photographs and some film from the archive that not many people have seen. Many people, when they visit Australia, are surprised at the number of times they hear the words of a welcome to country. This includes all our airlines, concert performances, sporting events, anything connected with government or major events that gets government funding is certain to start with an acknowledgement and a welcome to country. And that includes, wherever you are in Australia, a welcome to that particular Aboriginal or Islander country. I'll explain that in a second. But we've been very good at acknowledging our Indigenous past. Well, we have recently. We weren't early on in our story. So I want to start off with the most confronting for many Australians, and that is that our National Day is on the 26th of January, commemorating the settlement of European Australia in this country. Now, most people now are feeling uncomfortable with this date. Some say we should definitely keep it, and others say we should definitely move the celebration. And they prefer to call it, instead of Australia Day, Invasion Day, because I guess if you're of an Aboriginal descent, you would think that it was invasion. And the word settlement's unsettling, to say the least. It's estimated that when the first fleet arrived in Australia, there was anything between 400,000 and possibly up to 1 million people living on this country. The mainland, the island of Tasmania, and the various islands of the Torres Strait. Now, I just want to say something about this population because it's staggering in many, many ways. Just have that figure in your head of between 400,000 and 1 million. In a country so vast, it was impossible to work out how many people were living here. However, they started to do statistical research around the time that we became a federation of states in 1901. They did a count of Aboriginal Australia and Island Australia, and they came up of a figure of 93,000. But it was unreliable, because part of the Aboriginal tradition or custom was to go walkabout. That's how it was referred to, which meant that because they were hunter-gatherers, they would be always on the move. So nothing was predictable in those early days as far as population counts. So jump to 1933. On 1933, 33 years later, they did a more thorough count, and the population dropped to 74,000. Okay, pretty dramatic drop from somewhere between 400 and 1 million people. And in 1995, they did an even more thorough statistical gathering, because by that stage, Aboriginal people and Islander people were given the vote by then. So the figures that they had for 1995 of the total population of our Indigenous people was 200,000. Still a big drop. In 2011, the population count, another government gathering census, had 368, so about, let's say, 550,000, over 500,000 people claiming they were of Indigenous birth. In 2021, the last census, the population of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people jumped considerably. 901,000 people said they were of Aboriginal descent, and 40,000 odd said they were of Torres Strait Islander heritage. Now, to factor this extraordinary number, one has to look at a couple of things. Early on in our history, people did not want to say they were from Indigenous background. They felt that they weren't comfortable with revealing their family history. A bit like I mentioned the other day, people didn't like to say they had the convict stain, that they came from convict stock. And there's possibly, there was a lot of intermarriage between early settlers and the Aboriginal people, not so much the Islander people. And these people, they don't look Aboriginal, but they say they are, and the government believes them. So it's got a question mark over this extraordinary jump in our Indigenous community. But whatever it is, it's 3-point-something% of the population. So fair enough. So what people ask is, where did these people come from? Well, the Torres Strait Islanders, up off where we are now, Thursday Island being the biggest island, is actually a number of islands, and they're Melanesian people. And you can see from when you look at them that they look more Islander than Aboriginal. They have different facial structures and different customs, and they're Melanesian. The theory about the Great Migration, well, there are 3 possible answers to where these people came from. The most likely one, I think, is originally from Africa, like we all come from really, via Asia, and some 60 to 70,000 years ago, when the landmass between what we know as the continent of Australia and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, which were just sort of passed as we came round the bend, was possibly quite shallow, if not originally all one landmass. So they could have possibly walked, or the waters were so low they could have come across. So that's really the first theory, that they came in one big migration because possible starvation at the time, living in the centre of the equatorial area where it was hot, and they decided to get on the move. They would have had to fight some of the fiercest and largest dinosaurs ever in Australia. Some of the biggest ones have been found, not living, but their bones and so forth, in Queensland. There are quite a few dinosaurs in Queensland. Is there any Queenslanders here? No. All right. The second theory is that there were 3 distinct, separate migrations that came down here in waves by land and possibly, as I mentioned, low sea level, and people settled here. Really, there's only 2, but we've been here, or they've been here, a long, long time. This Mungo man, discovered in 1974, was then recognised as the world's oldest human remains, at least 40,000 years, 43,000 years actually, old, and they did DNA testing, extensive DNA testing on the tissue, the bone and so forth, and it was all certified. And then the custodians of his remains down in the South Australian region of Australia said, no more testing, we just want to lay these bones to rest. So that's what they did. But let's just have a look first at, and they have a flag welcoming the remains back. Just have a look at this. This is what Australia and its Indigenous history really is. The Aboriginal people refer to their countries. These are all different countries, believe it or not, Aboriginal countries within Australia. And each one of those countries is about the same size as a small European country, right? There were over 220 of these nations or country. The Aboriginal people refer to them as mobs. And they all had different languages. How the hell did they communicate? Well, they managed to communicate in some way, we know that. But there were over 600 dialects within those 220 odd languages. Now, 220 odd languages, a lot of different gabbles, I can tell you. The remaining languages, there's probably about 120 languages remaining. 77,000 Aboriginal people speak a language, and that includes the Torres Strait Island, which has a sort of Creole language, which is part of their tradition. The largest speakers of language are in the centre of Australia, around the Uluru. This is the Pitjantjatjara people, and it's a beautiful language. It's a musical language. I remember when how many years ago? About 15 years ago, I put out a recording with the Sydney University that I work with that was song poetry from the people of the rainforest area of North Queensland. So we've just passed that area. And this was a unique language, obviously. And at the time that I put the recording out of people doing this song poetry, there were only 3 speakers left. And about 2 years after I put the recording out, there were none. So that language is one of the many dead languages that we now look at. I'm often asked what's the difference between the New Zealand Maori and the Australian Aboriginal people. There's a big difference, all right? When the Polynesians came down and settled in New Zealand, what they called the land of the long white cloud, the local people call it the land of the wrong white crowd. We Australians, with our Kiwi cousins, call it the land of the long white shroud because we think nothing happens there. But the difference between the two cultures was that the New Zealand had food everywhere they turned. By the sea, in the land, they had those giant chickens, those Maoris, that there were something like 4,000 different types of bird that couldn't fly, that had labels on them saying, "Eat me." In Australia, and for that reason, they didn't have to travel. They didn't have to, like the Australian Aborigine, become gatherers and be on the move all the time. So in New Zealand, they built villages, structures, houses, long halls and so forth. In Australia, they built temporary residences and they moved on. And of course, we also know the big difference there is that the New Zealand Maori stood up to the British and said, we don't want you here. And they, in fact, even when Captain Cook went to New Zealand and tried to make peace with the people, they speared, I think, 18 of his crew when he took an inland mission. In Australia, they weren't so violent, although they looked violent. Unfortunately, there was never a treaty signed, and that's another story altogether. Okay, just moving on. The description Aboriginal came into use around 1789, so it was only a year after the settlement they started to use this word Aboriginal. They were hunter-gatherers. We didn't realise how clever they were. We just, were part of that mentality of the noble savage, but they're not quite as smart as we are, us white people. And of course, we got it all wrong. And 220 odd years later, we now realise that they were highly skilled as hunter-gatherers and as a people in things like medicine. They had their own traditional medicines, gathering of food, what to eat, what not to eat, when to eat it, when to pick it, just their affinity with nature. In the world's harshest climate, they were extraordinary. However, and they ate anything. I mean, if it moved, it was possibly good tucker. So, I mean, this little graph shows you what they ate. That's a dugong up there on the top left on it. A lot of them around in the oceans around here. And goannas, they may seem a bit strange for you to eat a lizard or something, but they knew how to cook them. Kangaroo, of course, and all sorts of greens, lettuces and things that they knew were native, and berries that gave, extraordinary acidic value, vitamin C to your system. So they did evolve and work out what not to eat. When the colonies arrived, the native people, well, we did the most stupid thing imaginable as a settlement. We built Sydney, our settlement, on the Indigenous people's prime hunter-gathering area of this area of Gadigal, where I come from. So we basically forced them out of the Sydney Basin immediately, and we decimated them with alcohol, introducing them tobacco, and then smallpox and measles and so forth. This is not an unusual story in any country in the way that it deals with or dealt with its Indigenous population. It's a tragic story, and it's a familiar one. One of the worst stories was actually the island of Tasmania, where it was the second settlement, right? New South Wales penal colony at Sydney, and then Tasmania was for the hardened criminals. So people were sentenced from England to go to either Botany Bay, Sydney, or to Tasmania. That little poster there is interesting because it was actually a poster from 1830, that's early on in our history, and what it's showing is that if a white man kills somebody, or a black man kills somebody, they'll be treated equally, the same. So that's what that poster is telling us, that the white man hanging on the garret there got what he deserved. Of course, it was rubbish. Now, we know from history that there were about 8,000 Aboriginal people living on the island of Tasmania. And it just gradually, like in Australia, the rest of the mainland, that population started to reduce. So between 1802 and 1833, the population was really just down to 300. And it was considered a nuisance. The colonial government wanted to just get on with its administration of the penal settlement, and they didn't want their stock speared by, Aborigines and so forth. So what they did is that they formed what they call the Black Line. And this Black Line was just all these soldiers abreast right across the island. It's quite small. And they just progressively walked and rounded up any Aborigines they could find, and then for their own good shipped them off to an island where they all died there was nothing there for them. It was tragic. And this Truganini was the last recorded Aboriginal person to die, and that was 1866. It's a great shame on Australia's history that we allowed such horror to happen. Natives were seen as curios, as this photograph will show you. I mean, Charles Darwin had written his thesis, and of course where we're going is named after Charles Darwin, who did come to Australia and gave talks and so forth. So there's a bit of a relationship there. But they were still seen, the Aboriginal people were seen as a bit of a nuisance. And once again, to our shame, they were given poisoned flour, or they poisoned the water holes that they used, and many people died unnecessarily. Here's an extraordinary case. William Buckley was a convict who escaped in 1803 in the colony, and became Victoria, but down there, and he disappeared. And 30 years later, he reappeared, and he'd been living with the Aboriginal people, and this caused worldwide surprise. They just assumed, that anybody black was a cannibal, or that he'd going to be burned at the stake or something. But no, he came back 30 years later. He became an interpreter, a go-between between the Aboriginal people and the colonial government, and he eventually went into politics. I mentioned the poisoned flour, but we also had what is now referred to as frontier wars. And this was basically the Europeans thinking of the indigenous people as not quite human and a nuisance. And so we have had several recorded massacres. This one here at, the Mile Creek one in 1838, with the earlier one, a squatter in New South Wales had a big property. He wanted some workers. And so he went to an Aboriginal community and he said, "Can you all come, the children, the grandparents and so forth, and I need 10 men to help me with my stock." So they all came, and he looked after them very well, but some screw-loose local men came in one day in 1838. They rounded all the women and the old people together and beheaded them, all of them. The 10 men were out guarding the stock, so they came back the next day and found them and killed every one of them. It was just awful. And then they went back to the campsite and there was a baby still alive, so they threw it in a big fire with all the rest of the bodies. Now, the horrible thing about this, there were about 35 people killed, right? Hacked to death. I mean, just a terrible massacre. So, 3 weeks later, the killers were caught and taken down to Sydney, and they had a trial. There was outrage from the squatters, the white population, that anybody should be penalised for killing blacks. And there was no evidence, they said. The men who'd done the massacre pleaded not guilty, and 15 minutes later the court ruled not guilty. But the Attorney General at the time of the colony, whatever his position was, he requested a second trial because he'd heard about the child being thrown into the fire. And they had a retrial, and 10 days later, 7 of the men were found to be guilty. And they were the first whites to be punished for killing blacks. They were all hanged to death because of one child, not the rest of the 34 people. It was scandalous. The other notable incident was a few years later at Warrigal Creek, where there were 150 blacks in an area, and they were partly working for a white squatter as well, and a group of thugs came down again and massacred the lot. I mean, these stories, they just sound awful. The reason that they took this violence towards the community was that an Aboriginal had speared one of the local squatters in the leg, but it was certainly unfair retaliation. All right, just let's have a quick look at some of the good things in Aboriginal history, and certainly art is up there. Aboriginal art these days is internationally renowned, but it is extraordinary. It's beautiful. A lot of it is these monochrome sort of depictions of their totems. So Aboriginal people have a totem. So it could be a turtle, it could be a fish in this case, and they produce beautiful art, simplistic yet complex art with rudimentary paint made out of ochre, so ground, and they're very, very experienced in it. Certainly the art market sees it now, and some of them go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Extraordinary prices, really. This bottom one here relates to they look like spacemen down here, don't they? They look like something out of E.T. These people are depicted in cave paintings, and there are thousands of cave paintings across Australia, and also on rock surfaces. And you can see the colours are quite vibrant even now after thousands and thousands of years, and they date them. And this one here I particularly like because it's so ghostly. This is up at Cape York, up top of Queensland here. Beautiful things like that are now documented in a registry of cave paintings. These are memes. Memes are like a ghostly figure, once again like something out of E.T., and they're 20, 30,000 years old, some of them. They're just beautiful creations. A lot of them are related to the Aboriginal tradition, religion of the rainbow serpent. So they believe that this giant rainbow serpent was the creator of all things. It swept down and pushed the land aside and made valleys, and then rivers came. And I mean, it's a I guess typical Indigenous approach to trying to explain where things come from. But it's, once again, quite complex, and it's shown in many of the rock paintings as well. Wonderful stuff. They also paint on bark. They take whole slabs of bark, they're round, and they'll paint with these ochre colours on them. Once again, they're totems. That's a goanna. up there, a kangaroo down there, and the turtle there. And the bark paintings are just one of the areas that they excel. Your boomerang, you've heard about, the thing that they, when it comes back and they catch it. Well, they weren't all like that. The boomerang was a killing machine, and they quite often would, they were so skilled, hit a kangaroo or a wallaby or even a goanna and knock it out and then go to work on it. There was one big, massive one they used to hunt with, and it was called a Kylie, like Kylie Minogue. Not quite as deadly as Kylie Minogue, but it was quite good. And they used what they called a wurmara to put their spear in. It was like a bit of carved out wood which improved their force and their aim, and they could, once again, very accurately use this as a weapon. There's a wurmara, a spear thrower. And you can see how these people traditionally, they were very lean. They're not like obese or anything. Unfortunately, 21st century living has created a bit of a nightmare in that regard. I'm going to show you just a quick grab of an old film. This is 1940s, of a traditional ceremonial dance around for a funeral. It's very ghostly dancing, you know. This is the real thing. They're clapsticks, those things they're hitting together, and they're using a didgeridoo there, you can see. No, that really pants. Men had separate dances and traditions than women. They had men's corroborees, and they used these for all sorts of storytelling, commemorative events, and so forth. And they had their own music, and here's a little bit of a men's corroboree. The totem pole is a funereal pole, and on it are engravings which really, if you think of the Egyptian tombs having inscriptions, this is almost the same. It's a guide for the spirit world to take the body and take it to the dream time. Okay. I've been up here. This is the very top of Australia. You go to Darwin, you go right up the top. There's a community called Maningrita, and these photographs of some of the crafts they do, because they're very skilled. These are fish traps. They put them in the river and the fish come in, and they also use them for funereal tracks. That large mat, which is quite large, they use in the house. They're very prized. They're the fish traps up there on the right. I've done quite a lot of work in recording Aboriginal people. This is a traditional didgeridoo playing singer called Scotty Martin from Elizabeth in Western Australia. He's probably the last of the real songmen. He had over 500 songs in what he called his dreaming. And he said, I don't know where they come from. I wake up and I have these songs. I mean, it's mysterious, and for an old skeptic like me, it's like, how the hell did he get those songs? But he does. He does. He's a song man. That's what he does. The didgeridoo, I think you might have seen our guitar player sing last night. They let the white ants eat right through it. They put beeswax around the end of it, and then they make the scent of the bees like roll. sorry I'm hurrying, but I've got a lot to show you. The men, as I said, they have their own traditions and own dances and own storytelling. The women aren't allowed to see it. But the women have their own as well. They have their own songs. These women are from a recording I did in Central Australia, Catherine. And they paint their bodies in extraordinary ways as well. Look at these beautiful paint that they put on their back. And here's the men, here's the women of the Arenti tribe. And you can see they paint themselves up, but look at how the men do theirs. They do these cones on their heads that are really quite only in this area. So who knows where they were inspired to do that many, many years ago. And this is from 1901. One of the most important ceremonies that the Aboriginal people do is circumcision for initiation, coming of age. And these rare films from 1904 that were given to me show a young boy being circumcised when he's, and then they become a man. They have to do everything the men have to do in hunting and so forth. Part of the thing is that they throw him up in the air after they've done the circumcision. I think they catch him. And then a peculiar thing, the men rub the circumcision blood on the backs of each other. I've never been able to find out why, but obviously there's a symbolic reason behind it, and it must attract a lot of flies, I would have thought. Now, here's another peculiarity, pygmies. Now, people didn't believe this, but this is around 1900. This photograph was taken of, I mentioned the rainforests of Queensland. Well, that's where the pygmies came from. There was one tribe, one community. Now, had they been malnutrition, a result of malnutrition, or had they come over separately? I mean, we don't know. We never did find out because our stupid universities at the time couldn't work it out. But it's a fact. That's a real photograph. I mentioned the Torres Strait Islands. It's a number of islands. You can see the people do not look like Aboriginal people. They look like Islander people, Melanesian. The population today in the census in 2021 was around 44,000. People say they are Torres Strait Islanders, but there's only 4,500 population on the islands themselves, and most of them are on, certainly 2,700 are on Thursday Island, which is a big island. I mean, the fact is that one of the main activities of the island, or the islands, was pearl shell. They used to get the pearl shell, and there was quite an international market for it, but the pearl shell market collapsed, and the people left the islands and came over to the mainland and worked in the sugar industry and so forth. So today the island has its own councils and governing bodies, but it took us quite a long time to accept them as part of Australia, although they are. You may have heard the term stolen generation. Well, this is another one of our horror stories, I guess you could call it, that between 1869 and 1969, 100 years, over 100,000 children were taken away from their parents. I think the same thing happened in Canada to some extent. But they took them away from their parents for their own good, they said. And they put them in mission schools. And these church mission schools brought them up as young European girls or boys. And it took a long time for the government to apologise for this. All right, just quickly, in our Hall of Shame, we viewed our Aboriginal people as curiosities. This is Bungaree. He was a notable Sydney Aboriginal that the governor of the colony, Governor Lachlan Macquarie, a very successful government and intelligent, dressed him up as himself. And he even went to London to be shown to the Queen. I must say that Lachlan Macquarie, after Bungaree came back, gave him 15 acres of land as a reward. So he was looked after to some degree. He was called the Commodore, nicknamed. We also designated various tribal elders as king. King Billy was really a bit of a put down. And we also had horror stories like these, boot polish or floor polish, that was called and deriding Aboriginal culture. And a comic strip at the time in the 1940s and certainly the 50s when I was growing up, called Witchetty's Mob, depicted the Aborigines as wisecracking and probably, once again, a bit silly, but there you go. Another horror story, the Boer War. 50 black trackers were recruited to go and help the fighters in Africa, and in 1901 we introduced in our new parliament something called the White Australia policy, whereby no person of colour would be allowed to enter Australia. And in 1902, after the Boer War ended, these black trackers were refused entry to return to their own country after fighting for Britain. Horror story. Okay. Well, on the good side, Aboriginal stockmen are extraordinary. They're beautiful, dealing with horses, and they're renowned in the bush for their work. There's always been a lot of protest in Australia about how we move forward. An Aboriginal embassy in the 1960s was set up. 1972 this was set up, but certainly in the 1960s when I was a young man, there were lots of demonstrations, freedom marches. They took a bus from Sydney up to Moree because the Moree town in New South Wales had hot springs, but they wouldn't let the Aboriginal people of the area go in the hot springs because the whites use it. So there were demonstrations about that, freedom rides. In 1967, a man called Vincent Lingari, who was at Wave Hills Station, a big famous outback station, he decided that he would not agree with the government's role in looking after Aboriginal people, and they were hinting that they wanted land rights of their own land. So in 1967, he walked off with his Aboriginal mates off this big station and refused to work. It was a strike, really. And Australia as a whole massively voted in favour of allowing the government to make laws in respect of Indigenous people. And this has been an ongoing fight. I mentioned the tent embassy in the 70s, but it wasn't until one of our prime ministers got up in Parliament and apologised publicly. It was a very emotional time. He got up and he just basically said, "We're sorry for the stolen generation. We're sorry for the way that we've treated our Indigenous people, and we're going to make it better." Has it got better? Well, we have elected Aboriginal members of Parliament that represent Aboriginal communities. We've had an Aboriginal governor in South Australia. We've got more Indigenous people going through the education process, and we have some notable academics and lawmakers now that are Aboriginal background. But maybe we'll even have an Aboriginal Governor-General sometime. But I think before we do that, we have to accept Aboriginal people have a particular right as the first Australians and should be in our constitution. We blew it last year. We had a sort of a referendum that was hijacked. I personally thought it was a disaster, but we basically blew it. The Aboriginal people now have a flag for the Torres Strait Island and also the Aboriginal people, but until they get some sort of constitutional record, I think that recognition, I think that they're still voiceless in their own country. I hope it will change. Who knows? Anyway, thank you for listening today. I hope you found that interesting, thought-provoking, and if you want to, just tap me on the shoulder. Tomorrow I'm talking about significant events in Australia's history. It's titled Ratbags and Rabble-Rousers. There's a few laughs in it because Australians like to send politicians up and so forth, but it might make a bit more sense of questions like this. Anyway, see you around the ship.